Think about the place you feel safest. Your house, your yard, maybe your bedroom. That little walk you do from the front door to the kitchen, where you don't even turn the lights on at night because you know every step. Well, now imagine finding out that whatever you're most afraid of has learned that exact path too. It knows not just your house, it knows your routine and where you sleep. Tonight we're going through stories from people who say the haunting didn't stay where it started. But if you've ever told yourself you're safe because you're home now, these are the cases that'll make you question that. Welcome to Scary Mysteries, and thanks for tuning in. This is When the Haunting Follows You Home, Skinwalkers, Doppelgangers, and Shadow Beings. Number 5. The girl who was already home. Now, this account comes from a user who writes under the name Elise24 on a site that collects first-person paranormal experiences. She describes herself as a young adult in Michigan, recounting something that happened roughly 10 years earlier when she was 13 or 14. One weekday around 3 p.m., the bus dropped her off directly in front of her home as usual. As she walked down the steps, she saw her older sister in the open garage dragging out a garbage bag. When they locked eyes, her sister's face, it went completely white. The bag slipped from her hands, and she just stared, frozen, as Elise reached the bottom of the driveway. The younger girl's first thought was mundane and terrible. Someone must have died, and her sister didn't know how to say it. When she got close enough to speak, her sister still didn't answer. They went inside, where the older girl sat down, pale and confused, and finally managed a question. She said, You were at school?" Elise confirmed she'd been in class all day, and that's when her sister told her what had happened just 15 minutes earlier. According to the sister, Elise had already come home, and she remembered it clearly, sitting on her bed upstairs doing homework, the radio playing on the floor near the door. The bedroom door opened, and Elise walked in, exactly as she looked in real life, and complained that the music was a little loud. The sister said sure, go ahead and lower it. She watched as Elise crossed the room and turned the volume down, left, and then shut the door. After hearing the story, the two girls went upstairs together. The radio was still on, and the volume was turned down low, exactly as the sister remembered Elise leaving it. Whatever the older sister had seen, it wasn't just a trick of perception. Something in the room had been physically changed. Online commenters suggested possibilities ranging from a ghost mimicking Elise's appearance to the classic concept of a doppelganger, a supernatural double of a living person, often seen as an omen. In German folklore, a doppelganger is a wrath-like apparition of a living person. Meeting one's own double has long been treated as a sign of impending death. In this case, no death followed, at least according to the author's later comments. Elise herself doesn't label it definitively, as she notes that other strange events happened in that house, including disembodied voices, but says the doppelganger incident stands out, though it never repeated. Years later, she and her sister would again hear the unmistakable voice of a family member who wasn't home, another incident she mentions in the site's comment thread. Skeptics can argue misremembered timing, maybe faulty clocks, or an unknown third person in the house. But what makes this case stick is how ordinary the double's behavior was. It didn't threaten or deliver a warning or act out of character. It comes in, turns the music down, and leaves. Simple as that. For Elise and her sister, that's the part that lingers. The monster at the foot of the bed is one thing, but looking back on an afternoon and realizing that for at least a few minutes, your day contained two versions of the same person is something else. And, in my opinion, well, that scenario is much more frightening. Number 4. The Demon of Brownsville Road. Bob Kramer was a former Army officer an AT&T executive who'd grown up in Brentwood, PA, walking past the mansion on 3406 Brownsville Road, always imagining what it would look like inside. And the house, built around 1909, was his idea of a dream home. When his job transfer brought the family back to Pittsburgh in 1988 and the house suddenly hit the market, well, he pushed hard to buy it, though that might have been a mistake.
The most dangerous thing that happened that probably could have killed my son.
There were warnings that this wasn't your typical home from the start. And during a pre-purchase tour, their 2-year-old son had wandered off while the adults checked the basement. And they found him on the main staircase, shaking and crying so hard he could barely breathe, as if he had seen a ghost. And Bob's wife, Lisa, said the house was too big and that it gave her the creeps, but Bob was determined. The sellers also seemed unusually eager to make a deal. They accepted his first low offer with no negotiation. When he asked if there was anything wrong with the house, they assured him everything was fine, then volunteered that they'd even had a Catholic Mass celebrated in the living room. As a lifelong Catholic and former altar boy, Bob found that odd. Full Mass in a private living room is rare outside emergencies. He just filed it away and bought the house anyway. The disturbances started small. A pull chain on a closet light refused to hang straight, constantly wrapping itself around the bulb no matter how often they untangled it. Faucets seemed to turn on and off by themselves. Radios and lights also clicked on and off, and there were what sounded like footsteps and knocks in empty rooms. And more than once, the family woke to the sound of something heavy moving through the house when everyone was in bed. But for the most part, a lot of that was explained away as an old house with normal issues. But then came the smells and the shapes. Bob describes a stench that would roll through the house without warning, rotting, sulfurous, with no physical source, and a black fog-like mass that would collect in doorways and corners. Their oldest son eventually refused to sleep in his own bed entirely, instead curling up on the floor of his walk-in closet with the light on, saying that the room was scary. All 3 boys began waking to knocks and scratches on their doors. More and more often, Bob says he'd find them all piled into his bed by morning. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, this phenomena wasn't just noises and smells. Bob and a visiting attorney friend later described a dried brownish liquid that would appear on the walls all over the house, looking disturbingly like old blood. It would then just reappear after scrubbing and repainting. The family also reported claw-like scratches appearing on their bodies and escalating psychological pressure inside the house. His family itself was slowly breaking down. His wife and 2 of his children suffered serious mental health crises that required hospitalization. And finally, in 2003, things snapped. One night, his eldest son violently attacked him, and police were called, and Bob was arrested. The next morning, an elderly aunt who lived with them was found dead in her bed of natural causes. In Bob's telling, that double blow opened the floodgates. Activity in the house surged, and he finally reached for help beyond electricians and contractors. Over the next couple of years, priests and a church mystic of sorts celebrated Mass in room after room, blessed the property, prayed on the rosary, and conducted formal exorcism rituals. And Bob says each visit was followed by temper tantrums from whatever they were fighting, so stronger smells, louder knocks, and more dramatic manifestations. To explain why his house in particular was the target, Bob has pointed to local history. And he says he found an 18th century War Department letter describing a 1792 attack near Fort Pitt, in which a woman and 3 children were killed by Native American raiders, and believes that family died on his land and was buried in the yard. He also cites visions from the Catholic mystic about an abortion performing doctor and an old curse on the property. Whether all those details are true is basically impossible to nail down. And if you believe Bob, well, they make sense. And if you don't, well, then it's all just a bunch of speculation. Ultimately, the church's campaign ended in February of 2006 when priests declared the entity expelled. For several years, Bob and his eldest son turned it into a bed and breakfast, and today, the house still stands and is a private residence. Whether the hauntings have continued or ever even really happened in the first place, well, that remains unclear. Number 3. Shadow Man in the City. For one woman in Montreal, the shadow started as background noise in childhood, something seen from the corner of her eye and then gone. It stayed in the house she grew up in, always at a distance, never quite crossing the room. When she moved out on her own, she assumed she was leaving it behind with the old furniture, but that wasn't exactly what went down. Valerie, who shared her story with a site devoted to documented ghost encounters, traces it back to her early years in her parents' home. As she says, she grew up seeing shadow ghosts inside the house, never outside, appearing in different shapes, but most often as a human form she simply calls the Shadow Man. He looked like a person without features, no face, no clothes, just a thick, opaque silhouette standing where a person might stand. When she noticed him, he would vanish or run away, in her words, before she could ever get closer. He always seemed to keep his distance, and that distance is part of what let her live with it for so long. Over time, the sightings became part of the house's background. And then Valerie moved out, and for about a month in her new place, well, nothing happened. There were no figures in the hallway, no movement in her peripheral vision. She started to think maybe the Shadow Man had been tied to the old house, the way some people talk about ghosts staying with a specific building. Now, her mother, back at the family home, had a different perspective, though. According to Valerie, her mom told her she'd been hearing someone crying in the house after Valerie left, disembodied sobbing that went on for days on end. She says her mother began talking to the unseen presence, telling it that Valerie was gone and that it was time for him to leave too. Eventually, the crying stopped. Valerie thought the story ended there, but then one night in her new apartment, she woke up and realized something was inches from her face. The Shadow Man was leaning over the bed, his featureless face about 2 inches from hers. And for the first time in years, he wasn't at a safe distance or on the other side of the room. Now, he was close enough that if he'd been solid, she could have felt his breath. She says he vanished as suddenly as always, but the pattern changed after that. The shadow presence began appearing in other forms, a cat and a cloud. And the cat wasn't an animal per se, but a low, fast-moving black shape about the height of a house cat that darted across rooms. Others saw it too, friends and visitors she described as complete skeptics, who watched the small shadow streak through the apartment and had no ready explanation. The cloud, she says, was the strangest. It looked like a dense, dark mass drifting slowly through a room. Unlike ordinary shadows, it didn't spread or thin out. The edges stayed tight, the opacity constant, and it floated like a self-contained patch of darkness. And, like the others, it would eventually just wink out. And parapsychologists often group reports like hers under the umbrella of shadow people, a term for dark, human-shaped apparitions seen globally in bedrooms, hallways, and peripheral vision. Neurologists point to sleep disorders, medication side effects, and misperceptions in low light as mundane explanations. In Valerie's case, she doesn't claim answers, only experience. The childhood house, by her mother's account, eventually went quiet, and her new apartment did not. If the Shadow Man was ever attached to a place, he seems to have decided long ago that the place he was really interested in was her. And he's an unknown entity that simply really scares her and has, by her telling, no clear motive beyond just being there. Number 2. The Admiral's Hitchhiker. In the summer of 2009, a senior Naval Intelligence officer flew out to a private ranch in northeastern Utah that the government had quietly flagged as a problem. For him, it was supposed to be a brief site visit to check security, meet the scientists there, and then fly home to Virginia. Instead, within weeks of his return, his quiet suburban house turned into something closer to a haunted lab. Whatever he'd gone to study in Utah didn't stay there. It followed him back, and he wasn't the only one. The officer we're talking about is referred to publicly only by the pseudonym Jonathan Axelrod. He was a career engineer with top-secret clearances who would eventually become a 2-star admiral. In July of 2009, he and 2 colleagues, Jim Costigan and David Wilson, visited Skinwalker Ranch as part of the Pentagon's AAWSAP program, a defense intelligence agency whose main purpose was to study UFOs and related anomalies. On that first trip, all 3 men reported a frightening encounter with an unexplained anomaly on the property. Colm Keller, a biochemist who helped run AAWSAP, later described how the group left the ranch shaken but intact. The real damage started later, after Axelrod went home to his wife and 2 teenage kids in Virginia. Within a month, the pattern emerged. His family began seeing balls of light, blue, red, yellow, white, floating through their house and yard, as if the walls weren't even there. They heard heavy, deliberate footsteps walking up and down their stairs when no one was on them, and then came the figures. Black, human-shaped shadows that would be standing right over their beds when they woke up. It sounds crazy, but on top of that, the most disturbing visitors, according to them, looked less like people and more like animals out of folklore. The Axelrods described dogmen in their backyard, tall bipedal shapes with canine features, watching from the tree line and then vanishing. And one night after the family saw such a creature in their yard, they went out in the morning to check the area. On a tree near where it stood, they found deep, fresh claw marks. At the same time this was all supposedly happening, the family's health began to slide. Axelrod's wife saw flare-ups of systemic lupus and Raynaud's disease, while both teenagers suffered repeated bouts of intense flu-like illness, worse than the younger child. Now on its own, you could maybe write this family story off as a tall tale, even though this military man was not one to do that. But the thing about it is, Axelrod wasn't the only one. All 5 Defense Intelligence Agency personnel who were deployed to the ranch that year reported similar hitchhiker effects. Strange activity in their homes that seemed to latch onto them and then spread to spouses, children, even school friends. The phenomena clustered near bedrooms, hallways, and backyards. Many of these victims fell physically ill afterward. Colm Keller, who was trained in virology, started to think about it in biological terms. In interviews and a 2022 Edge Science paper, he described the hitchhiker effect as quasi-infectious. Contact with the ranch changed something in a person's perceptual environment, and that alteration appeared to be transmissible. People didn't come home with burns or broken bones, he said. They came home with an altered reality that their families were then forced to share. It was like the ranch had opened a door to another reality or dimension, and once it had been opened, it couldn't be shut no matter where these people went. That's why, out of all the weird reports that have come out of the Pentagon's Skinwalker program, this story is one of the ones that keeps coming back. Because it's one thing to say a place is haunted, but it's another entirely to suggest a place can reach across a continent, step over your threshold, and rearrange the rules inside your own house. Number 1. The man at the foot of the bed. Across message boards, podcasts, and late-night conversations, people who have never met describe the same figure. Tall, completely dark, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. He tends to appear in bedrooms and in doorways or at the foot of the bed while his witnesses are frozen between sleep and waking. Some see him once and never again. Others say they've never stopped seeing him, and that the dread of the inevitable next time that he shows up unannounced is unbearable. And the figure is widely known as the Hat Man, a specific variation of what researchers call shadow people. Black, humanoid forms perceived of solid darkness, and sometimes during episodes of sleep paralysis. He's not exactly a ghost and not exactly a monster. And no one really seems to be able to agree on what he is exactly, but everyone knows that for some reason, he's watching. One popular account comes from a user describing an episode from childhood. And they say that at 9 or 10 years old, they woke up in bed and realized they couldn't move, a classic paralysis event. And at the foot of their bed, a man in a hat and a long coat silently pulled on the string of their ceiling fan over and over. The child eventually regained the ability to scream, and that's when the figure vanished. Years later, when they researched sleep paralysis, they were struck by how many other people described the same Hat Man silhouette. The brim, the coat, the complete lack of facial features. Another witness, writing on Reddit's Glitch in the Matrix forum, recalls a single encounter in which they woke from a nightmare to find a huge, featureless man in a hat standing beside the bed, made out of blackness, with no depth or detail. They remember being unable to move, then screaming, watching him disappear into thin air, and later being unsettled to learn that others had seen nearly the same apparition. And not every report involves sleep paralysis, though, as another commenter notes that for them, the Hat Man appeared while they were fully awake, not trapped in the half-dream state usually associated with the condition. And the thing about this phenomenon is it's a lot more common than people think. So much so that articles in mainstream outlets and a recent episode of PBS's Monstrum note that the Hat Man is now a global folk figure, with stories surfacing from North America, Europe, and beyond. And TikTok videos parody him, and sleep researchers point to him as a textbook example of recurring cultural imagery. From a clinical standpoint, there are grounded explanations. Sleep paralysis can produce vivid, terrifying hallucinations as parts of the brain wake unevenly, and shadowy intruders are one of the most commonly reported themes. Stress, trauma, and certain medications can all increase the likelihood of such episodes. And furthermore, dream interpretations really do mean the same thing for the majority of the population. For example, being chased in your dream means you're avoiding something in your waking life, running away from it. Falling in your dream means a feeling of insecurity. In your waking life, something is slipping away. Now, these are very common dreams, and so the Hat Man is something similar. A person who comes out when we're half awake and half asleep, though why it's always him is hard to explain why. And taken individually, each Hat Man story is just that, a story, a snapshot of someone's worst night. Taken together, they map out something stranger, a silhouette that seems to move through decades of testimony without changing its outline. Whether you call that a shared hallucination, a modern folk demon, or something else entirely depends on where you stand. And for the people who've met him, the label doesn't matter much. What they remember is the feeling of being pinned in place while a featureless man in a hat decides how long he wants to stay. So that was When the Haunting Follows You Home. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please do subscribe so you don't miss out. It's simple, free, and helps us keep on moving on. Till next time, thanks so much for tuning in. Y'all stay safe out there, and I'll see you over in the next one.